Joining us now to break down the day's top headlines is Marc, the Director of Strategic Communications for the Trump campaign. Marc, I want to start with this Twitter scandal because it's the first time, I believe, that Twitter has put one of these little classification things at the bottom of a tweet, and it was done so for President Trump, and it was done so for a claim that I think there's debate to be had. It's not something that's just blatantly false, like a lot of the things we see on the internet. What's your response to that?
Well, two things. One, it's not surprising it's Silicon Valley, and they're going to do everything they can to silence conservatives, especially President Trump. But when it comes to the issue, we're talking about mail-in ballot fraud. And even a federal bipartisan study going back to 2005 with former President Jimmy Carter, former Secretary of State James Baker, found that mail-in balloting was the highest propensity for abuse and fraud. So it's something that should concern all of us. As it relates to the president, I mean, it's very interesting. They're going to fact check the president. They should be fact checking Joe Biden, and they would be doing it all day long. I mean, this is a guy who can't remember what year 9/11 is or how many grandkids he has or the fact that he thought he negotiated with world leaders who had died decades before it.
And I think this is a very troubling thing if I was someone working at Twitter because, for example, the Iranian leaders are still on Twitter right now. They don't get fact-checked. Louis Farrakhan is still on Twitter. They don't get he doesn't get fact-checked for some of the vile things that he said. So I think that now that they've opened up the floodgates, if you will, when it comes to this issue, does it suggest then that things they don't fact-check, that they agree with? I mean, there's so many questions when it comes to this, and I think it becomes very problematic for these social media platforms the more they try to get involved. So do you think the president is right to say that maybe it is time to regulate some of these companies?
Absolutely, and I think one of the areas, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm not saying what we might do, but I'll tell you one of the things that a lot of people are talking about is that these companies, these social media companies, they communicate with people via Wi-Fi. They communicate with people via cell phones, on our phones. Well, both of those services are regulated by the federal government, the Federal Communications Commission, just like a TV station, just like a radio station. So maybe if they're going to use the public's airwaves, they ought to act responsibly and in the public's best interest and not their own personal political interests.
And the more I talk to people about this subject, too, there are very clear legal ambiguities, if you will, when it comes to Title X protections. However you want to look at this, social media platforms are for sure experiencing the benefits on both sides without having the liabilities. I think a lot of people acknowledge the point that they either have to be a common carrier or they have to be an editor, but they can't be both because right now that is where they are. And I think it comes back to the internet kind of being the wild, wild west a little bit when it comes to this issue. But I hear, for example, President Trump, he's one of the first people I've heard really talk about taking action on this subject, along with Senator Josh Hawley. I'll hear about a lot of conservatives voice complaints about this subject, but I never really hear lawmakers follow through on it. Do you think that this will become a little bit more of a campaign issue that Republicans should run on?
Well, I think it'll be a campaign issue, but it's also something Americans should be aware of. And you should be aware that the fact that whether you're going through Facebook or any kind, or Twitter or any kind of other social media platform, that maybe you're not getting all sides of the news. I know many conservatives are already on the lookout when it comes to the overwhelming bias of the mainstream media. They need to apply that same filter to social media and make sure that they're getting the full story. President Trump will tell it to you. He's got an audience that's as big as the Super Bowl every year. You're just going to have to make sure you find it.
And that's something, too, that a lot of people would critique social media platforms for, is not incentivizing that debate. They put them in their own ecosystems. People generally only follow people that they agree with to begin with, but then these algorithms also make it even more so, where they don't provide you with the other viewpoint. They want to keep you where you're happy. They don't want to make you uncomfortable with facts that may be uncomfortable at times. So I think that is something that a lot of Americans are waking up to. But before I let you go, too, I do want to touch on the digital arm of the Trump campaign. This does tie into it a little bit. Does this affect in any way the way that maybe you guys are going to move forward? Are you going to just continue putting on content the same way that you have been?
Well, we've already discontinued a lot of the advertising on Twitter because of earlier actions that they had already taken. And so we'll continue to evaluate that. But like we said, we have a bigger social media and digital platform than Joe Biden could ever hope to find in his basement. We have one that rivals the audience of the Super Bowl when you include the president. And we're already doing programming every night of the week that's getting more than 1 million people watching it. Some of it gets 2.5 million, which rivals the top rated audiences on CNN and MSNBC. So we'll go and get the information out. We know the audience is there to hear from the president. And if they try to stop us, we'll just go around them and find another way.
Yeah, that's what Kellyanne Conway was saying before, too. I mean, the president has a direct connection to the people that he wants to speak to. And I think that's why sometimes people in the media are a little bit mad about it, is because he's kind of circumventing now the middleman that makes them so much money. But that's the way politics goes nowadays. Marc Lotter, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for coming on tonight.